The funeral of Mrs. Mildred Copley took place on a Tuesday morning that seemed determined not to commit itself to any particular season. The sky, pale and undecided, hovered somewhere between late winter and an apology for spring. In the churchyard, where grass never grew evenly, the mourners shifted their feet on gravel that was both too loud and too loose for solemn movement. Mildred Copley had, in life, been a woman of admirable consistency. She disapproved of most things with equal diligence, of the town council's spending, of the vicar's sermons, and of her late husband's prolonged enthusiasm for pigeon racing. Yet in death she managed to attract a larger congregation than she had ever tolerated in her drawing-room. This, as Mrs. Tallow of the Women's Institute murmured behind a gloved hand, was typical of the woman's contrariness. Inspector Pubright stood near the lich gate, his hat respectfully in his hands. It was not his habit to attend funerals unless they concerned official business, but Sergeant Love had mentioned that Mrs. Copley's demise had been a bit sudden. There had been no scandal, only a faint whiff of peculiarity, that delicate aroma which in Flaxborough often preceded a full banquet of rumour. As the coffin was lowered, Purbright's eyes wandered, not out of disrespect but curiosity. He observed the niece, Miss Clara Deering, a pale and neat woman who seemed perpetually to have just finished saying, "Oh, really?" Her husband, Mr. Gerald Deering, looked at his watch twice during the hymn, which, in Flaxborough, ranked as open rebellion. The vicar, Reverend Fallow, read the service with an air of cautious sincerity, as if he were afraid someone might write to the bishop about his pronunciation of everlasting. The burial concluded with murmured condolences and a brief scuffle of umbrellas as drizzle began to assert itself. Pubright lingered. He watched the small group disperse, leaving the grave looking both raw and self-conscious among the older stones. The mound was modest, tidy, and as yet undecorated, save for one wreath shaped like a heart, bearing a card that read, "From her devoted friend L." That night the cemetery lay quiet under a low mist. Mr. Hibble, the groundsman, claimed later he had locked the gate at precisely 6:30 and had seen nothing amiss. Yet when he returned at dawn, he noticed something that caused him to halt mid-step. On Mrs. Copley's grave, just above the damp lettering of her nameplate, a single red rose stood in perfect bloom. Its stem emerged cleanly from the soil, as though it had grown there overnight. The petals, still touched with dew, glowed faintly in the grey light. An image so improbable that even the birds, if they had noticed, might have looked twice. By 8 o'clock, the phenomenon had ceased to belong to Mr. Hibble alone. He mentioned it quite casually to Mrs. Platt, who came each morning to arrange her late husband's chrysanthemums. By 9:30, Mrs. Platt had just mentioned it to Miss Teat at the post office, and by noon the rose had achieved the status of an omen. At the police station, Sergeant Love was attempting to summarize the matter in his notebook. "Sir," he began cautiously, "it seems some folks are saying the rose means she weren't ready to go, that her spirit's still about." Pubright did not look up from his teacup. "A horticultural haunting," he suggested mildly. "Flaxborough never disappoints." Love hesitated. "Should we have a look at it, sir? Just to be sure no one's planted it?" Pubright smiled faintly. "Someone has, Sergeant. Roses don't bury themselves. The question is why, and perhaps when." He stood, adjusted his hat, and, as was his habit, took a slow breath before leaving the office. Outside, the air smelt of rain and earth, and faintly of something sweet, as though the rose itself were advertising its mystery. By late afternoon, when Pubright reached the churchyard, a small crowd had gathered behind the iron railings. He noted the composition with interest: a retired solicitor, 2 shopkeepers, one widow of unspecified morality, and a pair of schoolboys who seemed to think the rose might do something if they stared hard enough. Reverend Fallow appeared at his side, his face pink with anxiety. "It's rather unfortunate, Inspector," he said. "Superstitious nonsense, of course, but you know how people are." Pubright inclined his head. "Yes, and how roses are, occasionally." The vicar blinked. "You think it's deliberate?" "Everything in Flaxborough is deliberate," Pubright replied, still watching the flower. "Even sentiment." The vicar followed his gaze. "Do you suppose it's meant kindly?" "That," said Pubright, "is what we shall find out." As dusk fell, the rose seemed to darken with the light, its petals deepening into something almost crimson. Pubright looked at it once more, then at the mound beneath, and said quietly, as though to himself, "Some flowers bloom too late, Reverend, and some far too conveniently." He turned away, his coat collar lifting slightly in the wind, while the vicar stood uncertain beside the grave. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. By morning, the story of the rose that bloomed after the funeral would be in every teacup in Flaxborough. By the following morning, the rose had achieved celebrity. Not the sort that required photographers or interviews, but the sort more insidious, whispered, embroidered, and improved upon by people who were certain they'd known it first. At the cosy Nook tea rooms, a formidable centre of civic intelligence disguised as a cafe, Mrs. Platt and Miss Teat were holding what they described as a private conversation in the public interest. Their tea had gone cold, as it often did when they were engaged in moral autopsies. "I saw it with my own eyes," declared Mrs. Platt, stirring with unnecessary energy. "Blood red it was. You could tell it hadn't been there the day before. Not a bud, not a twig." Miss Teat leaned forward with relish. "They say Mrs. Copley was never properly happy after her husband passed. Perhaps it's his way of—" She paused, delicately. "Of showing forgiveness." Mrs. Platt sniffed. "What forgiveness? For what? If the poor man could forgive her pigeon soup, I dare say he'd forgive anything. No, my dear, this is more earthly." Across the room, Mr. Harby, who ran the hardware shop, pretended to read his newspaper. The paper was upside down, and his hearing, which was normally selective, had suddenly become keen as a curate's conscience. Within an hour, the rose was no longer merely a floral curiosity. It had become an emblem of sin, possibly adultery, certainly scandal. By noon, the rumour had divided neatly along gender lines. The women favoured the idea of forbidden love. The men preferred something practical, such as a prank. The Reverend Fallow, meanwhile, found himself the subject of several winks and knowing nods as he passed through the market square. It was said that Mrs. Copley had given generously to church charities. Some said too generously. At the police station, Sergeant Love was attempting to record the names of those claiming to have information of a psychic nature. By the time Pubright returned from a meeting at the town hall, the desk was littered with statements of impressive imagination. "Sir," said Love, looking flustered, "we've had 3 people say they saw a woman in black in the churchyard the night before the funeral." "Did they indeed?" said Pubright mildly. "The same woman, I presume?" Not exactly. One said she had red hair, another grey, the third wasn't sure but mentioned a limp." "Ah, the Holy Trinity of Flaxborough eyewitnesses." Pubright set down his hat. "And Mr. Hibble?" "Swears blind he locked up, sir. But—" Love hesitated. "He says someone might have had a spare key. There's talk Mrs. Copley lent one to her niece for visiting her husband's grave." Purbright's expression did not change. "Miss Clara Deering? Yes," a considerate gesture. Love looked puzzled. "Do you think she went back, sir?" "I think she is about to be asked. said Pubright, reaching for his coat. The Deering residence. That afternoon. The Copley house stood at the edge of Flaxborough, its facade neat but joyless, like a smile practised for the parish magazine. Miss Clara Deering received Pubright in a drawing-room that smelled faintly of lavender polish and suppressed resentment. "Oh, Inspector," she said, managing both politeness and anxiety in one syllable. "Do forgive the disorder. We've only just finished with the funeral guests." The disorder consisted of a single misplaced cushion. Pubright, who had seen crime scenes with less precision, inclined his head. "A difficult few days, I imagine." She sighed delicately. Aunt Mildred was particular. She disliked to be fussed over, but disliked even more to be neglected. "A demanding balance," said Pubright pleasantly. "Might I ask, Miss Deering, did you by any chance visit the cemetery the evening before the funeral?" Her fingers tightened on her handkerchief. "Why, no, Gerald. My husband insisted we stay in that night. I was quite exhausted. Why do you ask?" "Routine, I assure you." Pubright smiled with bureaucratic serenity. "There's been some curiosity about the rose." Her composure flickered. "That ridiculous thing. Honestly, Inspector, must the police be involved in botany?" "Only when flowers appear to have opinions about the deceased," said Pubright gently. Before she could respond, a voice called from the hallway, deep, irritated, and unmistakably male. "Clara, has that insurance fellow gone yet?" Mr. Gerald Deering entered without waiting for permission. He was a man who looked as though life had continually disappointed him, and he had developed a professional grudge against it. Pubright introduced himself, to which Mr. Deering responded with the perfunctory stiffness of a taxpayer acknowledging an inevitable bill. "Hope you're not wasting your time with all this superstitious nonsense," he said. "If some fool wants to plant a rose, let them. My late aunt was hardly likely to appreciate it." "That's an interesting observation," said Pubright, his tone light. "You didn't care for her?" "Didn't say that," Deering replied too quickly. "She was family, but she had ways, opinionated, interfering, always writing to the council about something or other." Pubright inclined his head. "Useful civic spirit." "Busybody," Deering corrected. "If you ask me, Flaxborough's better off without you." "Gerald!" Clara's voice was tight as string. "Please." There was silence. Pubright smiled faintly, the sort of smile that concealed a ledger of mental notes. "I shan't keep you," he said. "Just one more thing. Was your aunt fond of gardening?" Clara hesitated. "Not especially. She always said flowers made too much mess indoors." "Indeed," said Pubright, "and yet one has chosen to follow her to the grave." Later that evening, at the police station, Love found Pubright staring thoughtfully at the window pane, where rain traced delicate paths like invisible ink. "Something on your mind, sir?" Pubright turned slowly. "Several things, Sergeant. None of them quite real yet." "About the rose?" "About people, Love," said Pubright. "The rose is merely their excuse." He walked to his desk and tapped the corner thoughtfully. "Find out, will you, whether Mrs. Copley had any life insurance? And," he paused, "whether her niece stood to benefit." "Quietly, mind." Love scribbled the note with enthusiasm, sensing the thrill of progress. Pubright, however, seemed less certain. His eyes drifted toward the rain-soaked street outside. Flaxborough glowed faintly in the lamplight, calm, self-satisfied, and, he suspected, ever so slightly poisonous. Reverend Fallow had never liked surprises, especially botanical ones. He believed the natural world should remain strictly where it belonged, outdoors, behaving predictably. The idea of a flower appearing overnight upon a parishioner's grave was, to his mind, not so much a miracle as a nuisance. By Thursday morning he was regretting the convenience of living within sight of the churchyard. Each time he looked from his study window he could see the pale mound of Mrs. Copley's resting place and, like an impudent punctuation mark, the red rose still in bloom. The view, he felt, was doing his sermon preparation no good whatsoever. He was contemplating the relative sinfulness of curiosity when a soft knock sounded at his door. "Inspector Pubright," he said aloud without looking up. "I rather suspected it would be you." Pubright, standing in the doorway, inclined his head with a smile that managed both apology and inevitability. "Forgive the intrusion, Reverend. I thought it best we discuss Mrs. Copley before the entire town canonizes her." Fallow gestured him toward an armchair upholstered in what looked like leftover sermon covers. "Tea?" "Gratefully," said Pubright. "Sergeant Love's version tends to resemble an industrial solvent." As the vicar poured, Pubright noted the tremor of the man's hand. Not severe, but noticeable. "You performed the funeral service, I believe?" "Indeed, though I confess the experience was not spiritually uplifting. Mrs. Copley was not what one might call universally beloved." Pubright accepted his cup. "Yet you spoke warmly of her." "Professional obligation, Inspector," said Fallow with a rueful smile. "We are encouraged to bury sins with the sinner. Flaxborough, however, has a way of resurrecting both." Pubright's smile deepened slightly. "I'm beginning to appreciate that." He sipped, then set the cup down carefully. "Tell me, Reverend, had Mrs. Copley expressed any particular concerns before her death?" The vicar looked momentarily surprised. "Concerns?" "Of a worldly sort," Pubright added. "Finances, quarrels, letters." Fallow frowned thoughtfully. "Well, she was certainly preoccupied with her will. Mentioned it twice in our last conversation. Quite insistently, in fact. She had some anxiety that her niece might not understand her intentions, as she put it." "Interesting," murmured Pubright. "And did she say what those intentions were?" "Not precisely, only that she wished her gift to the parish to remain secret until the right moment." "Secret gifts can be awkward things," said Pubright mildly. "They encourage the wrong sort of gratitude." The vicar hesitated, then said quietly, "There was also the matter of her letter." Pubright looked up. "Letter?" "Yes. One she brought to me the day before she died. She seemed oddly nervous. Said she wanted it kept safe, but only for a short while. I placed it in my desk drawer, but when I looked for it yesterday, it was gone." Pubright raised an eyebrow. "Gone?" "Quite vanished. I assumed I had misplaced it, though I cannot imagine where." "Was it sealed?" "Tightly, and addressed. To her niece, I believe, though I did not read the name closely." Purbright's voice was calm. "Who else knew you had it?" "Only my housekeeper, Mrs. Deeks, a trustworthy woman, though possessed of a curiosity that could be called devotional." Pubright nodded slowly. "Do you suppose anyone might have visited the parsonage since Mrs. Copley's death?" "Well, yes. Miss Deering came by yesterday morning to discuss the memorial arrangements. She was most polite, though rather brittle." "Did she inquire about her aunt's letter?" Fallow hesitated. "She may have mentioned it in passing. Yes, she did ask whether her aunt had left any papers in my care. I told her no, of course. At that time, I believed the letter merely mislaid." Pubright did not reply at once. He stood walking to the window where the churchyard stretched beyond a fringe of dripping hawthorn. The rose was still there, defiantly alive in a landscape of resignation. "Reverend," he said at length, "how well did you know Mrs. Copley?" Fallow folded his hands. Too well to admire her, not well enough to despise her. She was a woman of faith, in herself, chiefly, but she possessed a curious sense of justice. Pubright glanced back. Justice? She liked to see wrongs corrected, provided she defined the wrongs herself. A silence fell. The ticking of the vicar's clock filled it with pious monotony. Finally, Pubright said, "You've been most helpful. I shall ask Mrs. Deeks whether she recalls the letter. Quietly, of course." Fallow nodded, relieved. "Inspector, you don't believe this Rose business is connected, surely?" Purbright's eyes softened with the faintest irony. "Everything in Flaxborough is connected, Reverend. That's what makes it so peaceful." Later, that afternoon, the police station Sergeant Love looked up as Pubright entered, brushing rain from his shoulders. "Sir, I've found something about Mrs. Copley's will," he said, brandishing a file. "It was altered a fortnight ago. A new solicitor from Lincoln handled it. The niece inherits most of the property, but there's a separate bequest." "To whom?" "A fund for church restoration, apparently. But it's not specified which church." Pubright took the file, scanning. "Curious. Perhaps she wanted to surprise the Almighty." Love chuckled, uncertainly. "Also, sir, Postmistress Miss Teat says she found an unstamped envelope behind her counter yesterday morning, addressed in Mrs. Copley's handwriting. She swears it wasn't there before." Pubright looked up sharply. "Where is it now?" Vanished, sir. Someone took it while she was fetching her spectacles." Pubright sighed. Flaxborough's postal efficiency never fails to astonish. He closed the file, his expression thoughtful. 2 missing letters, both written by the same woman on the same day, and a flower blooming where no flower should. "Coincidence, sir?" Pubright smiled faintly. "In Flaxborough, Sergeant, coincidences are just manners pretending to be accidents." That evening, as dusk settled over the churchyard, Reverend Fallow stood again at his window. He thought briefly that the rose looked paler than before, as if time were catching up with it at last. Then he noticed something else, a faint disturbance in the soil at the edge of the grave, as though someone had been there recently. He blinked, uncertain. When he looked again, the mist had thickened and the mark was gone. He turned away uneasily and began to lock up for the night, unaware that across town Inspector Pubright was making a note in his small, careful handwriting. Letters, wills, and flowers, all forms of remembrance. But who precisely wishes Mrs. Copley to be remembered wrongly? The next morning found Inspector Pubright walking along the narrow gravel path that curved behind St. Cuthbert's Church. The mist clung low to the ground, muffling his footsteps and giving the graveyard a hush that was almost deliberate, as though the dead themselves were listening in. Ahead of him, bent over a spade that looked too large for his narrow frame, was Mr. Horace Hibble, the cemetery groundsman. He had the pallor and posture of a man accustomed to being blamed for the weather. "Morning, Mr. Hibble," Pubright said, approaching gently like one greeting a nervous animal. Hibble looked up, startled. "Oh, morning, Inspector. Didn't hear you coming. Ground's a bit soft today. Bad for the mowers." "Bad for everything but roses, it seems," said Pubright. The man's eyes flickered briefly toward Mrs. Copley's grave. "Ah, that thing caused me no end of trouble, that has." "Trouble?" Pubright asked mildly. "People come in here all hours, poking about. Women taking photographs like it's the Queen's garden. I'm supposed to keep things respectable, Inspector, not sentimental." Pubright gave him a sympathetic nod. "Quite so, and yet it's remarkable, a rose blooming from fresh earth." Hibble straightened, leaning on his spade. "Didn't come from the ground, sir. Came from a hand." "You saw someone plant it?" No, sir, but I know me soil. He gestured at the grave. That's topsoil, not churchyard earth. Fine-grained, see, not the kind we get here. Someone's been and set that plant in a little patch they brought themselves. Pubright crouched to look, his expression unreadable. When did you notice this? The morning after the funeral, about 6. Grave was neat as when I'd left it, except for that bloom. And the gate was locked? Aye, sir. I checked. Only key besides mine's kept in the vestry. Reverend's got it. Pubright considered this. So whoever planted the rose had access, or the right key. Hibble nodded miserably. That's what worries me. I swear, Inspector, I never gave it out. Of course not. Purbright's voice was soothing. But tell me, Mr. Hibble, have you seen anyone here at odd hours lately? Evening visitors, perhaps? The groundsman hesitated. Well, I did hear some at that night before the burial. A sound like soft digging. Thought it might be a cat or the wind. Didn't want to bother no one. Pubright smiled faintly. The wind is often guilty of more than it should be. Hibble's gaze dropped to the ground. Begging your pardon, sir, but people are saying it's Mrs. Copley's way of making peace. That rose, I mean. Peace with whom, do they say? With herself, or with whoever wronged her. Can't rightly tell which. Pubright rose slowly, brushing soil from his gloves. Perhaps both, he murmured. Thank you, Mr. Hibble. You've been most helpful. He turned to leave, but the gardener called after him, his voice uncertain. Inspector, you don't think I had anything to do with it, do you? Only people have been looking at me queer, like I'm some kind of grave fiddler. Pubright looked back, with that small, disarming smile that always managed to make people both reassured and vaguely worried. Mr. Hibble, if everyone in Flaxborough guilty of fiddling were arrested, we'd need a prison the size of Lincolnshire. The groundsman managed a nervous laugh, and Pubright walked away, his thoughts threading quietly through the morning fog. The police station, tinily later. That day, Sergeant Love was waiting with his usual mixture of eagerness and confusion. Sir, I've checked with the Reverend about that spare key. He says he hasn't lent it to anyone, except, for one occasion. Indeed, said Pubright. To whom? Miss Deering, sir. Said she wanted to visit her uncle's grave one evening before the funeral, apparently very emotional. Pubright sat down slowly. That would be the same evening our Mr. Hibble heard the wind digging. Yes, sir. Love hesitated. There's more. Postmistress Miss Teets come forward again. Says she remembers seeing Miss Deering near the post office after hours that same night, standing under the lamp, holding a letter. Purbright's eyes narrowed. And did she post it? No, sir. Box was empty next morning. Pubright tapped his pen against his notebook. And what about the solicitor who handled Mrs. Copley's will? Name of Cartwright. Offices in Lincoln. Bit pompous. Said Mrs. Copley sent her last instructions by hand, not post. No record of who delivered them. Pubright gave a thoughtful sigh. Flaxborough seems to specialize in hand deliveries, letters, flowers, inheritances. He rose and walked to the window. Across the street, the ironmonger's display of watering cans gleamed like trophies for moral hygiene. The inspector smiled faintly. Sergeant, I think it's time we paid another visit to the Deerings. But before that, find out whether Mrs. Copley had a gardener or anyone tending her plants recently. Love blinked. At her house, sir? Precisely. A woman who disliked flowers but ends up buried with one is either ironic or instructed. That evening, the Deering home. Miss Clara Deering greeted them with her usual air of brittle composure. Her husband, Gerald, was notably absent. A business meeting in Boston, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Purbright's manner was unhurried, almost social. "I've been speaking with Mr. Hibble," he began. "He tells me the rose was planted by hand." She blinked. "Then whoever did it is very foolish." "Possibly sentimental," Pubright corrected gently. "Though I gather you had a key to the churchyard." "I returned it to Reverend Fallow," she said quickly. "At the same night, I wanted to say goodbye properly, that's all." "I see. And you were alone?" Her hands tightened. "Yes." "Curious," said Pubright softly. "Because Miss Teet recalls seeing you that same evening near the post office with a letter." For the first time, Clara's poise cracked. "That woman always watching. Yes, I had a letter. It was personal. I tore it up." Pubright inclined his head. "Ah. And the rose?" "I know nothing about any rose," she burst out. "You think I'd desecrate my aunt's grave?" Purbright's tone remained steady, almost kind. "Desecration, Miss Deering, is a matter of intention. Sometimes we bury truth and plant something prettier over it." She stared at him, pale and trembling. "What are you implying?" "Nothing at all," said Pubright, reaching for his hat. "Merely observing the horticultural habits of grief." As he and Love stepped outside into the evening damp, the sergeant exhaled. "She's hiding something, sir?" "Undoubtedly," said Pubright. "The question is it guilt or gratitude?" Love frowned. "Gratitude. Some people conceal one as the other," said Pubright, eyes glinting. "Especially when money's involved." That night, the rain came heavy. By morning, Mr. Hibble would discover something new. The rose that had caused so much talk had vanished, uprooted cleanly, leaving behind only a small hollow in the soil, shaped like the absence of an answer. Pubright, when informed, merely nodded. "Everything in Flaxborough," he said quietly, "blooms only as long as it's useful." Mrs. Copley's house stood on a small rise overlooking the high street, a place from which in life she could supervise the moral hygiene of half the town. The curtains had remained drawn since her death, as if the windows themselves were in mourning or sulking. When Inspector Pubright arrived that afternoon, Miss Clara Deering met him at the door with a smile that was as much apology as welcome. "Oh, Inspector," she said, "you must think me dreadfully rude after our last conversation. I was upset. Quite beside myself." "Perfectly natural," Pubright replied pleasantly. "Bereavement brings out all sorts of horticultural impulses, I find." She coloured faintly, unsure whether to take that as kindness or reproach. "Do come in. I thought it best we speak here, where I can perhaps be of help." The hallway smelled of beeswax and disuse. A line of ancestral portraits, unsmiling faces, firmly convinced of moral superiority, watched Pubright as he entered the drawing-room. There, tea had been laid with meticulous formality. Silver pot, lace cloth, and a plate of sponge cake so aggressively symmetrical it might have been measured by a surveyor. "Milk?" she asked. "Please, just a trace." She poured with tremulous precision. Her eyes, though, remained watchful. "I suppose everyone's still talking about the rose." "I imagine so," said Pubright. "In Flaxborough, silence is reserved for marriage proposals and income declarations." That drew the faintest smile. "You make everything sound so detached, Inspector. Don't you ever form opinions?" "Rarely," Pubright said. "They tend to spoil the ending." As she handed him his cup, a small, framed photograph on the mantelpiece caught his attention. It showed Mrs. Copley seated in her garden, expression severe, hands gloved. Behind her, in faint blur, stood a younger man, gardener's overalls, indistinct face. "Your aunt employed help, then?" he asked lightly. Clara followed his gaze. "That's Mr. Digby. He tended her roses, left last year. Said the work gave him rheumatism." "Roses again," murmured Pubright. "Did she keep in touch with him?" "Oh, I shouldn't think so. Aunt Mildred didn't encourage personal attachments, particularly among the hired help." Pubright set down his cup. "And yet her grave has been attended to rather personally." Her expression cooled. "Inspector, I told you." He raised a hand gently. "Forgive me. Old habits die hard, even in the living. May I ask, was Mrs. Copley's solicitor ever invited here?" "Only once, I think. She disliked legal men. Said they charged more than vicars and forgave less." "Sound advice," Pubright said. "Do you recall his name?" "Cartwright, from Lincoln." "Ah, yes, the gentleman who handled her new will." Clara looked startled. "New will? I didn't know there was another." Purbright's tone remained conversational. "Her previous solicitor retired. It seems she made some amendments, beneficiaries unchanged, but there was a peculiar clause, a church restoration fund without designation." "Church restoration?" she echoed faintly. "But Aunt never attended services." "Perhaps she was investing in a better afterlife," said Pubright. "Or perhaps she intended something else entirely." She stared at him for a moment, then said softly, "You think someone forged her will?" "I think," Pubright replied, "that wills are like gardens. They attract the wrong sort of pruning." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Gerald Deering, entering with the air of a man determined to appear innocent of everything, including courtesy. "Inspector," he said briskly, "I didn't expect the pleasure." Pubright rose politely. "Mr. Deering, your wife was just being most helpful." "Ah, yes, helpful. That's Clara all over," he said without warmth. "May I ask what this is about now? Surely you've had your fill of flowers and folklore." "Not quite," Pubright said mildly. "The rose appears to have been removed." "Removed?" Gerald frowned. "By whom?" "That's rather the question." Gerald gave a short laugh. "Perhaps the same lunatic who planted it." "Possibly," said Pubright, "though I'm inclined to think its disappearance was more practical." He turned slightly, studying the man with polite curiosity. "Tell me, Mr. Deering, where were you the night before the funeral?" "At home, of course. We were both here. You can ask my wife." "I have," Pubright said gently. "And she mentioned you had visitors that evening." For the first time, the self-assurance faltered. "Visitors? Rubbish! Who told you that?" "Mrs. Deeks, the Reverend's housekeeper," Pubright said, sipping his tea. "She thought she saw a motor car outside this house late that night, one she didn't recognize." Gerald's face reddened slightly. "Probably a delivery van. People come and go." Pubright set down his cup with deliberate calm. "At 9:30, on the eve of a funeral? Delivering what? Sympathy by the crate?" Clara spoke suddenly too quickly. "It was no one, Inspector, truly. Gerald's friend from the Rotary Club stopped by, something about a subscription." Gerald's glare at her was quick, unguarded, and sharp enough to answer the question she hadn't been asked. Pubright noticed it, said nothing, and smiled faintly. "Of course," he said, "a man must tend to his obligations even in grief." He stood. "Thank you both. I won't trouble you further today." As he reached the door, Clara said in a small voice, "Inspector, will the rose matter much? Truly?" Pubright looked back. "That depends, Miss Deering. Sometimes a rose is only a flower, sometimes it's an apology with roots." Back at the station, that evening, Sergeant Love was typing a report that contained more smudges than sentences. "Sir, bit of news about that gardener, Digby." Pubright removed his coat. "Yes." "Turns out he's living in Broughton now, runs a little nursery business. He left Mrs. Copley's service after some argument about pay." Said she'd promised him a bonus that never came. Did she now? Said Pubright, thoughtful. A woman who disliked extravagance making promises to a gardener? Remarkable. Shall I fetch him in? In due course, Pubright said. For now, see if you can find anyone who saw that motor car outside the Copleys' house on Monday night. Quietly, love. We're not issuing an invitation to gossip. Love grinned. Too late for that, sir. Gossip's already RSVP'd. Pubright smiled faintly. Then let's at least serve it tea. That night, as the lamps dimmed over Flaxborough, Pubright sat alone in his office, reading through Mrs. Copley's probate summary. His pencil hovered above one detail, a deposit of £50 made 3 days before her death to an account marked Restoration Fund. No recipient listed. He leaned back, murmuring to himself, restoration indeed. Of what? A church? Or a conscience? Outside, the wind rattled the panes, and from the churchyard, unseen in the dark, came the faint scent of turned earth, the ghost of a rose that refused to stay buried. The post office in Flaxborough occupied a converted draper's shop and still smelled faintly of tweed, gum, and secrets. Miss Teat, its long-serving mistress, was not so much an employee of Her Majesty's Postal Service as its self-appointed moral censor. She handled letters as though they were confessions, and frequently treated them as such. That morning she was unusually agitated, rearranging stacks of envelopes that required no rearranging. "Inspector Pubright," she announced as he entered, "I'm so glad you've come. This business has taken 10 years off me, though of course one doesn't notice such things until the mirror starts telling tales." "I'll take your word for it, Miss Teat," Pubright said gravely. "You mentioned an envelope that had, reappeared?" She leaned conspiratorially across the counter. "Indeed! Found it this very morning in the till drawer of all places. I assure you it wasn't there yesterday." Pubright regarded the envelope with mild curiosity. It was addressed in a firm, careful hand. "To be opened by Miss Clara Deering after my funeral." No postage, no return address, just the signature, Mildred Copley. "And you're certain it's genuine?" Pubright asked. "Inspector, I'd know Mrs. Copley's handwriting even if it were written in invisible ink. She never learned to make a proper F, always looked like a walking stick." Pubright smiled faintly. "Indeed, and who might have placed it in your till?" "That," said Miss Teat, straightening proudly, "is the mystery, but I have my suspicions." "Of course," said Pubright. "You'd hardly be Miss Teat otherwise." She lowered her voice. "Yesterday morning, while I was fetching a fresh ink pad, Mrs. Deering called in for stamps. Only she never bought any. Said she'd changed her mind and left in rather a hurry. When I returned to the counter, this envelope had appeared. I didn't notice until closing time." Pubright examined the seal. "Untampered, by the look of it." "Quite so, but if you ask me, Inspector, it wasn't her who placed it there. She wouldn't risk being seen. No, this has the smell of a man's doing." "Really?" "Yes. There was a gentleman waiting outside in a motor car, the same dark saloon that's been seen near the Copley house after dark. You can draw your own conclusions." Purbright's eyebrows rose very slightly. "I frequently do, Miss Teat, though they seldom resemble anyone else's." He pocketed the envelope carefully. "Thank you. I shall return it once I've verified its contents." Miss Teat looked alarmed. "But, Inspector, surely it's private." "Only until it becomes evidence," Pubright said kindly. "And in Flaxborough, privacy tends to have a short shelf life." At the police station. Later. That afternoon, Pubright studied the envelope under the desk lamp, noting the texture of the paper and the faint smear of sealing wax on one corner. Finally, he slit it open with the tip of his penknife. The letter within was short, written in Mrs. Copley's unmistakably upright hand. If this reaches you, my dear Clara, it means I have gone sooner than expected. Do not let anyone persuade you to part with the house, especially not Gerald. There is something buried here that must remain. You will find what I mean when the roses next bloom. Your affectionate, though occasionally reproving, Aunt Mildred. Pubright read it twice, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for his phone. Love, fetch Mr. Deering from his office. No alarm, no handcuffs. Just tell him we'd like a chat about gardening. The interview room. Gerald Deering entered with the weary indignation of a man who considered himself persecuted by bureaucracy. Really, Inspector? Must this go on? I've cooperated fully. If you're hoping for a confession to floriculture, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. Pubright offered a seat. You surprise me, Mr. Deering. I'd thought a man with your temperament would prefer pruning to paperwork. Gerald sat, scowling. What's this about now? A letter, Pubright said mildly. Addressed to your wife. Written by her late aunt. It warns her not to sell the house and mentions something buried there. The man's hand twitched. What nonsense! That woman was half senile, yet lucid enough to change her will, said Pubright, and to make deposits under a false restoration fund. Gerald's colour rose. You've no right. Quite right, Pubright interrupted. But it's remarkable how little right one needs when murder begins to look like accountancy. For a moment, Gerald looked almost frightened. Then the expression hardened. Murder? You can't be serious. She died of a stroke. Indeed she did, said Pubright softly. So the doctor said, though I wonder, had she eaten that evening? He glanced briefly at his notes. Your wife mentioned a meal you prepared, a rare act of domestic virtue. Gerald forced a laugh. Now really, Inspector. Calm yourself, said Pubright. I'm merely exploring possibilities. For instance, what becomes of a letter that threatens to expose financial impropriety if it's found before the funeral? Gerald leaned forward, eyes narrowed. You're fishing? Always, said Pubright pleasantly. It's remarkable what bites. There was a knock at the door. Sergeant Love entered, holding a small, earth-streaked envelope. Sir, this just turned up at the churchyard gate, found by the verger's boy. Pubright took it, opened it, and extracted a folded scrap. Inside was a single line in large, untidy capitals. Stop digging. Gerald stared, bewildered. What the devil? Pubright placed it gently on the desk. Ah, the Flaxborough equivalent of a death threat. Brisk, economical, and badly spelt. He looked up, his tone suddenly mild again. Tell me, Mr. Deering, have you ever heard of a man named Digby? Digby? Gerald frowned. My aunt's gardener? No. Well, I met him once or twice. Why? Pubright smiled. Because Mr. Digby appears to have resurfaced. Quite literally, he's returned to Flaxborough. Gerald's eyes flickered. What for? Pubright's smile widened a fraction. That, Mr. Deering, is what we shall ask him. But my suspicion is he's come to collect what was buried. That evening, the churchyard. Pubright walked alone through the damp grass, his torch beam sliding across the stones. Where Mrs. Copley's grave had once been adorned by the red rose, there was now only a faint hollow. He knelt, pressing the soil lightly with his fingers. Something resisted. A fragment of waxed paper, torn, stained with moisture. Inside it, a second envelope, blank, the contents dissolved by rain. He held it under the torchlight, thinking. The words from Mrs. Copley's letter echoed in his mind. You will find what I mean when the roses next bloom. He straightened, gazing at the dark line of the Copley house across the town. Somewhere within those walls, he felt sure, lay the rest of the message. The thing that Mildred Copley had buried not in the earth, but in conscience. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was finishing his report. "So, sir," he said, "you think someone's been trying to keep that letter hidden since before the funeral?" "Precisely," said Pubright. "Mrs. Copley's final correspondence seems to have circulated more widely than her obituary." Love frowned. "But why hide it? It's just a warning about selling the house." Purbright's tone was reflective. "Because, love, the letter isn't really about property. It's about what lies under property, and perhaps what someone stood to lose if it were found." He folded the page carefully and slipped it into the file marked "The Rose Case." "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll have a little chat with Mr. Digby." By the time Friday morning spread its pale light over Flaxborough, the rose had ceased to be a mystery and become a full-blown haunting. The grave where Mrs. Copley lay, the same that had sprouted its singular scarlet anomaly, now displayed another transformation. The flower was gone, yes, but in its place the earth had sunk slightly as though the grave itself had drawn a breath inward. The verger's boy who found it first swore he had seen the soil move. "Like someone sighing underneath," he told anyone willing to listen. And in Flaxborough there were many. By 9 o'clock word had reached the cosy nook tea rooms, the nerve centre of public hysteria. Miss Teat was there, naturally, spreading alarm with the decorum of a parish nurse distributing cough syrup. "It's not natural," she declared to Mrs. Platt and a rapt audience of jam-tart enthusiasts. "First, a rose blooms out of season, then it vanishes, and now the ground itself sinking. If that doesn't suggest unrest, I don't know what does." Mrs. Platt pursed her lips. "Unrest of what sort, dear?" "The spiritual sort," said Miss Teat solemnly. "Mildred Copley never forgave easily. If she's stirring, it's because someone up here's got something of hers." A general shiver passed over the teapots. At that moment, a slow-moving figure entered the tea-room. Muddy boots, cap in hand, face the colour of old parchment. Horace Hibble. The crowd turned as one. Hibble shuffled to the counter. "Cup of tea, please. Strong." Then, as if noticing the silence, he added awkwardly, "In case anyone's wondering, I didn't touch that grave. Not me. Someone else did, and at night too. I seen the marks." Miss Teat leaned forward. "Marks?" "Footprints. Men's boots by the look. Deep ones. I covered 'em up. Didn't want folk panicking. Wish I hadn't now." He took his tea, leaving the silence thicker than the steam. By the time Hibble had reached the door, the tale had changed. Within an hour he had been seen digging by lantern light and talking to the ground. By lunchtime he was suspected of grave tampering for personal profit. And by tea-time half of Flaxborough had decided that the late Mrs. Copley had been buried with diamonds. The police station. Late morning Sergeant Love looked up from his reports as Pubright entered, removing his hat with absent care. "Sir, the town's in uproar again. Some say the grave's collapsing, others that there's a second rose underneath." "Both," said Pubright mildly, "sound equally unattractive." Love hesitated. "Also, sir, that Gardener Digby turned up, waiting in reception. Says he's got something to show you." Pubright nodded. "Ah, our itinerant horticulturalist returns. Let's hear what he's been planting lately." Interview room, midday. Mr. Albert Digby looked like a man made of compost, small, solid, faintly damp, and uncomfortably sincere. He sat nervously twisting his cap between calloused hands. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Digby," said Pubright pleasantly. "I hear you once tended Mrs. Copley's garden." "That's right, sir, for 3 years, till she give me the sack." "Ah," said Pubright. "Was that overpay, as I'm told?" Partly, Digby said, frowning. Said I'd overcharged her for manure, but it weren't that. Truth is, she wanted me to dig somewhere I didn't want to. Pirbright's eyes sharpened. Go on. She pointed out a patch near the old rose bed, told me to take up the soil about 2 feet down and make sure no one sees. Well, I'm not daft. I asked what for. She said, never mind, just see it's done and tidy again. Next day she gives me notice and pays me off. Said my conscience was a liability. When was this? Last summer, July, I reckon. Did you ever find out what she wanted buried? Digby shook his head. Never saw nothing. But there were a small wooden box she carried out herself. Said it was her husband's keepsakes. Didn't look heavy. Pubright leaned back. And you've come back to Flaxborough now because... Digby hesitated. Because of that rose, sir. The way it bloomed. It's the same type I planted for her last year. Damask hybrid. She was fond of the colour. When I heard it showed up on her grave, I knew someone had been digging again. Maybe where she told me not to. Pubright regarded him steadily. So you came to see if your work had been disturbed? Yes, sir. Only someone's beaten me to it. That evening, Pubright and Sergeant Love walked out to the Copley grave under the slow drizzle that Flaxborough reserved for moments of minor revelation. The soil was indeed subsiding slightly, just enough to suggest interference. Pubright crouched, turning up a small clod of earth. The faint scent of rose lingered there still, but beneath it a darker tang of old wood and mildew. Love, he said quietly, fetch Mr. Hibble. We'll do a discreet inspection before the town decides Mrs. Copley's risen for questioning. Within half an hour, they'd cleared the top layer of soil. Beneath it lay a small cavity, lined, crudely, with waxed cloth. Inside, splinters of what had once been a wooden box. Nothing else. No jewels, sir, Love observed. No diary, no letters. No, said Pubright, straightening. But someone's been here twice, once to hide it and once to remove it. That, Sergeant, is practically a correspondence. Love looked puzzled. You mean whoever planted the rose came back to take the box? Precisely. The flower was merely camouflage, the horticultural equivalent of a polite cough. Once the funeral passed, the same person returned to collect their parcel. And that person? Pubright brushed the dirt from his hands. Whoever most needed Mrs. Copley to stay silent, and her secrets well buried. There'd been night, the vicarage window. Reverend Fallow stood watching the graveyard again. The mist had returned, soft and white, curling over the stones like gilt in visible form. He told himself not to look, but he couldn't help it. In the place where the rose had been, something else now caught the faint light, a scrap of paper fluttering weakly. He went out with a lantern, his cassock brushing the wet grass. Kneeling, he picked it up. It was part of an old letter blurred by rain. Only 3 words remained legible. The money stolen. The vicar shivered, folded the paper carefully, and glanced toward the church gate, just in time to see a figure vanish into the fog beyond. Police station. The next morning, Reverend Fallow placed the fragment before Pubright. I thought it best you have it. It may mean nothing. Quite possibly, said Pubright, examining it. But in Flaxborough, nothing has a curious habit of being something later on. Love looked hopeful. So, sir? Murder after all? Pubright smiled thinly. Let's not be hasty, Sergeant. In this town people don't kill for passion, only for reputation. He tapped the paper gently. Still, a letter that speaks of stolen money, a vanished box, and a grave that refuses to settle. I'd say our late Mrs. Copley has left us quite the parish puzzle. He looked out of the window. and if I'm not mistaken, the answer is about to pay us another visit. Have Mr. Deering brought in again? Quietly this time. I want to see how he behaves when flowers start to die. Monday evening brought a drizzle so fine that it seemed designed not to inconvenience anyone important. Inside the parish hall, the air was heavy with the smell of damp coats and administrative piety. The monthly meeting of the parish council was about to begin, an event that promised, as always, more indignation than progress. On the agenda were the usual items: flower beds, refuse bins, and matters arising from the minutes. Tonight, however, there was also item 4, Restoration Fund, Mrs. Copley bequest. That final item was the reason Inspector Pubright was seated unobtrusively at the back, hat in hand, looking for all the world like a man who had wandered in by accident. At the head of the table sat Councillor Harby, proprietor of the hardware store, chairman of the council, and self-appointed conscience of Flaxborough. He adjusted his spectacles and began. Item 4, he said solemnly, concerns the bequest left by our late Mrs. Mildred Copley. The amount, modest but welcome, is to be used for the restoration of parish property. A polite murmur followed. Mrs. Tallow, who represented the Women's Institute, leaned forward. Property singular or plural, Mr. Chairman? Harby hesitated. That, Mrs. Tallow, remains to be clarified. The will is somewhat unspecific. Miss Teat, who was attending in her dual capacity as postmistress and gossip laureate, spoke up. Perhaps it was meant for the church roof. Everyone knows it leaks. Reverend Fallow coloured faintly. The leak is minor, Miss Teat. Divine providence, not neglect. Harby coughed. In any case, the funds are temporarily in the council account, awaiting transfer to the appropriate authority. Pubright, from his corner, noted the faint shuffle of unease that passed around the table. It was the sound of consciences comparing balance sheets. Mrs. Platt raised a gloved hand. I heard the amount was £50. Surely that won't mend much roof. 50? Harby said quickly. Yes, that's the figure. Purbright's eyes narrowed. The solicitor's report he had read gave a slightly different number. 65. The vicar spoke, too carefully. If the money was left for restoration, it should, of course, go through the diocesan fund. Indeed, said Harby, but the council must first process the, handling fee. Miss Teat blinked. Handling fee? Harby cleared his throat. Administrative costs, postage, forms, etc. Pubright watched with quiet amusement. It was like observing a group of people trying to hide behind transparent umbrellas. Then Councillor Mrs. Fenshaw, a woman of the moral firmness usually associated with vinegar, leaned forward. I think, she said sharply, we ought to know where the money came from before deciding where it goes. Mrs. Copley was not known for generosity. There was an uncomfortable silence. Reverend Fallow looked down at his notes. The source is immaterial, Mrs. Fenshaw. The deceased was, as we all know, a woman of... He hesitated. Principle. Principle? She echoed. That woman once wrote to the Chronicle because my husband used the phrase my word in public. I should like to see what principles she's funding now. At this, a small, involuntary chuckle escaped Pubright. Every head turned. He rose politely. My apologies, Councillor. Please continue. I was merely enjoying democracy in its purer form. Harby frowned. Inspector, I hadn't realised this was a police matter. Nor had I, said Pubright. Until your treasurer telephoned this afternoon asking whether the late Mrs. Copley's funds could be withdrawn in cash. The effect was immediate. The sound of collective inhalation filled the room. Harby's face went through several shades of civic embarrassment. A misunderstanding, I assure you. Routine procedure. Pubright nodded pleasantly. Quite. And when the misunderstanding attempted to withdraw £65 instead of 50, the chairman swallowed. Ah, clerical error happens every day. Indeed it does, said Pubright softly, though rarely in such round numbers. He let the silence sit until it became uncomfortable, then smiled. No need to trouble yourselves. I'll handle it from here. If Mrs. Copley intended charity, I should hate to see her disappointed. Reverend Fallow looked up sharply, meeting the inspector's eyes for the briefest instant. It was a look of shared knowledge and unease. After the meeting. The rain had intensified by the time Pubright stepped out into the square. Sergeant Love was waiting under the lamp-post, holding 2 umbrellas that looked equally surprised to find themselves open. "Any progress, sir?" "Of a moral nature, certainly," said Pubright. "Financial? We'll see. It appears our parish worthies have been performing quiet acts of redistribution." Love frowned. "You mean they've nicked it?" "Let's say they've temporarily mislaid it. Very British crime, really, committed by committee." He paused. "By the way, love, find out who originally managed Mrs. Copley's bank transfers. I want to know whether those £50 or £65 came from her personal account or a joint one." "Joint, sir?" "With her husband," Pubright said, "or possibly with someone else entirely. Mrs. Copley's sense of morality might not have extended to bookkeeping." Later that evening, Reverend Fallow's study, the vicar sat at his desk, head in hands. On the blotter before him lay the torn fragment of the letter he had found at the grave. The words "the money stolen" seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, as though reproaching him. There was a soft knock. Mrs. Deeks, his housekeeper, entered. "Beg pardon, Reverend. There's a gentleman to see you. Says he's a gardener." "Send him in." Albert Digby stepped in, hat clutched, eyes darting nervously. "Evening, Reverend. Sorry to trouble you. I thought you'd want to see this." He produced a small, earth-streaked object, a metal tin, dented, still bearing traces of waxed cloth. "I found it behind the lich gate. Someone must have dropped it last night. Looked important." Fallow opened it. Inside were several old banknotes, damp and half-decayed, totalling perhaps £30, and a folded slip of paper. He unfolded it and read, "Repayment of what was taken, for the church, not the council." Fallow stared, pale. "Good Lord," Digby cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, Reverend, but it weren't me left it." "I know, Mr. Digby. I rather think I know who did." "The police station, the same night." Pubright listened without interruption as Fallow recounted the discovery. When the vicar finished, the inspector simply said, "So, someone has a conscience after all, or a fear of exposure." He turned the note over thoughtfully. "For the church, not the council. That distinction may be more theological than financial, but it narrows our field nicely." Love looked puzzled. "How so, sir?" Pubright smiled. "Because whoever wrote this knew that Mrs. Copley's real bequest wasn't money. It was proof, and someone's trying very hard to unbury it." He stood, putting on his coat. "Tomorrow, love, we call on the Deerings again, and on our good counsellor Harby. I have an idea that Flaxborough's Morality Committee has been funding more than flower beds." That night, as the rain eased into fog, a single figure slipped through the churchyard, pausing briefly at Mrs. Copley's grave. The figure bent, placed something small upon the mound, a fresh rose identical to the first, and whispered, almost tenderly, "Rest easy, old girl. It's all back where it belongs." Then the figure vanished into the mist. And in the house by the square, Inspector Pubright, half asleep over his notes, murmured, "One rose for guilt, another for penance. I wonder what blooms next." Inspector Pubright had long held that Flaxborough revealed itself best on foot. From behind a car windscreen, the town looked ordinary enough, neat, restrained, moral. But walking its narrow streets, one could hear the little gears of pretense turning beneath the paving stones. That evening, after the council meeting's commotion and the vicar's revelation, Pubright left the station without his coat and set off alone. The drizzle had faded to mist, and the lamps along Market Street glowed like weary saints. He passed the bakery, dark now except for the faint scent of warm dough that lingered from the day's trade, the ironmonger's window where Councillor Harby's gleaming watering can stood like trophies of civic virtue, and the boarded-up cinema where once Flaxborough had gone to admire other people's sins. Purbright's shoes made almost no sound on the wet pavement. He found that suited him. He had been turning over in the slow, deliberate way of a man polishing an idea rather than grasping it, the sequence of events that had brought him here. A funeral for a woman no one quite liked. A rose that bloomed too soon and vanished too quickly. A letter written in warning and hidden in guilt. A fund of money that seemed to shrink as it moved from church to council to conscience. And beneath it all, a kind of tenderness. That was the puzzle. The crime, if there was one, was not cruel, it was embarrassed. Someone had stolen not for greed, but for shame. He paused at the edge of the square. From the church tower, the clock struck 9, a sound that Flaxborough's inhabitants obeyed as faithfully as any commandment. Across the road, the window of the vicarage glowed faintly. He could imagine Fallow inside, struggling with the double weight of guilt and relief. Guilt for the deceit he now suspected, relief that some penitent soul had returned the money. Purbright's thoughts drifted further toward Mrs. Copley herself. A difficult woman, yes, but not foolish. Her letter had spoken of something buried and of the rose's next bloom. She had known, somehow, that what she hid would draw the guilty back to her grave. That was the heart of it. She had planted her revenge like a seed. He turned down Willow Lane, a narrow path that bordered the back gardens of the older houses. Somewhere beyond one of those brick walls lay the Copley property, its garden overgrown, its soil perhaps still concealing what she had meant someone to find. Purbright stopped, leaning lightly on his umbrella though the rain had ceased. The air smelled of earth, soap and coal smoke. From an open window came the faint sound of a piano playing Abide With Me, hesitantly as though whoever played it had forgotten the comfort of hymns. He closed his eyes, listening, then smiled a little. People, he murmured to the night, are always tidying their sins, folding them away into boxes, planting flowers on top, but the roots always find daylight. The Copley garden. By 9:30, he had reached the Copley house. The gate creaked, complaining at its duty, as he pushed it open. He crossed the small lawn, pausing beneath the sagging lilac tree. The soil near the old rosebed was soft again, freshly turned, not by rain, not by accident. Kneeling, he touched the ground lightly. There was a depression, faint but definite, shaped like a boot print, the same as those Hybel had seen at the grave. Someone had been here within the last day. And from the faint imprint of a heel, smaller than a man's, he guessed who. Clara Deering. He looked up at the house, the upper windows dark, but one curtain slightly open. She was watching him, perhaps, perhaps not. He didn't move for a moment, letting the damp air fold around him like an understanding he hadn't quite reached. If Mrs. Copley had hidden money or letters here, Clara would have found them by now. The second rose on the grave had been her apology, or her farewell. Purbright straightened, brushing soil from his hands, and walked back to the gate. The investigation was no longer about legality, it was about intent. He could charge theft, perhaps. But to what end? To prove that grief, guilt, and family pride made for poor arithmetic. Flaxborough already knew that. A chance encounter. As he reached the corner of the street, a voice emerged from the mist behind him. "Evening, Inspector." Albert Digby stepped out, cap in hand. "Didn't mean to startle you. Been taking a last look at the old place myself." "Late hour for nostalgia," Pubright said mildly. Digby shrugged. "Couldn't sleep. Funny thing, though. When I looked at that patch by the rose bed, I thought I saw summat shiny in the soil. Bit of brass, maybe." "Brass?" "Yes, sir. Like the corner of a box. Might be nothing. But it's just where Mrs. Copley told me not to dig last year." Purbright's expression did not change, but his tone softened. "Mr. Digby, would you care to show me in the morning? Daylight has a better sense of humour than ghosts." "Gladly, sir." As Digby turned away, Pubright called after him. "One question, if I may. When Mrs. Copley gave you your notice, did she seem frightened?" The gardener thought a moment. "No, sir, not frightened, just disappointed, like she'd bet on someone's goodness and lost." Pubright nodded. "Thank you, that's all I needed." The inspector alone. He walked back toward the station. The street's nearly empty now, save for the faint glimmer of the lamps and the hiss of wet tires from a distant lorry. He was thinking not of law, but of proportion, that peculiar moral algebra that governed towns like Flaxborough, where crimes were seldom grand but always revealing. The money, he felt certain, was never meant for the church or the council. It was hush money, blackmail perhaps, or restitution, a payment to ensure silence about something unseemly but not lethal. And yet Mrs. Copley had chosen to bury proof of it, to let her death unearth the truth. The rose, the letters, the missing box, all part of a small, perfect trap for hypocrisy. He stopped by the river where the lamps rippled across the dark water. His reflection looked back at him, neat hat, calm face, eyes quietly amused. "People hide what they can't confess," he said softly, "and the rest of us pretend not to notice." A church bell struck the quarter. Pubright turned toward home. Tomorrow would bring Digby, daylight, and perhaps an ending. But tonight Flaxborough slept, uneasy, dignified, and blissfully unaware that its peace owed everything to one woman's carefully planted truth. The evening light was thin and amber, the sort that flatters even Flaxborough's chimneys. Inspector Pubright, punctual as always, arrived at the Deering residence precisely at 6:30. He was shown in not by Clara but by the maid, who seemed eager to vanish as soon as possible. The drawing-room had been rearranged since his last visit. The silver tray had gone, the photograph of Mrs. Copley no longer occupied the mantelpiece but had been turned discreetly toward the wall. Even grief in Flaxborough, Pubright thought, eventually learned good manners. Clara entered quietly, her face pale but composed. "Inspector," she said, almost with relief, "I thought you might come." Pubright inclined his head. "I usually do eventually." She managed a weak smile. "You found something."
"Found? No, confirmed." "Yes." He gestured to the window. "You might wish to sit, Miss Deering. These things are easier when one's feet are still." She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap like a schoolgirl awaiting marks. Pubright took the armchair opposite her. "This morning, I accompanied Mr. Digby to your aunt's garden. He showed me the place she had once forbidden him to dig. We unearthed the corner of a small brass box. Its contents were gone, naturally. But there were traces, fragments of wax and a torn envelope lining. Clara's fingers tightened on her handkerchief. "And what do you think was in it?" "Letters," Pubright said softly. "Old ones, written by your aunt, or possibly to her. They would have been awkward to explain, especially to a town that mistakes morality for proof." Her eyes widened slightly. "You mean she had an affair?" Pubright smiled faintly. "If so, a discreet one. But the point is, those letters existed. Your husband, I believe, discovered them after your aunt's death. She must have mentioned them, or hinted." Mr. Deering, being of the practical persuasion, saw both danger and opportunity. Clara rose abruptly. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Purbright's tone remained courteous. "Mrs. Copley had revised her will. You inherited the house. Your husband, by marriage, the problem of keeping up appearances. And then there was that bequest, so-called restoration fund, £50, withdrawn in cash by Councillor Harby on your husband's request." She stared at him, speechless. Pubright continued gently, almost kindly. "Your husband tried to buy the silence of someone who knew. Perhaps Harby himself, perhaps another. But then your aunt's letter to you surfaced, warning you not to sell the house and to find what was buried. It was her last jest, really. A message to ensure the guilty would expose themselves." He rose, walking slowly toward the window. The sunset had faded into the bruised blue of evening. "Your husband came back that night," Pubright said. "He used the churchyard key, dug up the box, removed the letters, and planted a rose over the disturbed soil to disguise the act. He must have thought himself clever." He turned back to face her. "But guilt is untidy. When the rose became public gossip, he panicked. He sent it removed, perhaps by you, perhaps by himself. And later, when the council funds were questioned, he replaced part of the stolen money, hoping it would pass for repentance." Clara's lips trembled. "You have no proof?" Pubright smiled slightly. "Proof, no, but Flaxborough thrives on something subtler. Pattern. Every action in this town has a social twin. When your husband withdrew the money, he left a signature far more distinct than handwriting. The faint scent of fear people noticed." He paused, then added softly, "And so did you." Her eyes filled, but she said nothing.
Purbright's tone gentled further. "You didn't help him for greed, Miss Deering. You did it because you were afraid. Afraid the town would see your family disgraced, afraid of being pitied." Tears finally came. "He said it was just old love letters. He said Aunt Mildred would have ruined us if they got out, that the money was only to buy them back, to keep things quiet." "I'm sure he believed that," Pubright said. "But I rather think your aunt's secrets were her own, and harmless. What she wanted was a lesson for those who tried to manipulate her memory. She planted her own trap, and your husband stepped neatly into it." There was a sound from the doorway. Gerald Deering stood there, his face grey. "You think you're clever, Pubright?" "Rarely," said the inspector. "But occasionally the facts arrange themselves politely." Gerald came forward, shoulders tense. "I took the letters, yes. She was blackmailing us, me. She knew about that missing money from the council account. I only wanted to make it right before anyone noticed." "And the rose?" Pubright asked softly. The man hesitated. "A gesture. She always loved them. I thought if I gave her one, it'd look like peace." Pubright regarded him kindly, almost pityingly. "You see, Mr. Deering, that's the trouble with symbols. They bloom beautifully, then die inconveniently." He stepped closer. Mrs. Copley wasn't blackmailing you. She knew about the fund, yes. The council's missing contribution which you borrowed for a speculative business scheme. She planned to return it quietly after her death, to spare you. The money in that tin, the one left at the Lich Gate, was hers, not yours. Gerald stared. You can't prove that. Pirbright's tone was serene. I don't have to. The Reverend's conscience will do it for me. You see, he's already informed the diocesan office. The fund is being audited. I imagine you'll find your accounts lighter than expected. A silence followed, heavy but strangely dignified. Clara had risen, her hand pressed to her throat. "Gerald," she whispered, "you said it was over." "It nearly was," he muttered, then turned to Pirbright with sudden bitterness. "What will you do? Drag me through court over a dead woman's grudge?" Pirbright shook his head. "Not at all. The file will read, irregularities corrected, matter closed. Flaxborough does not enjoy scandals, but you'll find the town forgets more slowly than the law does." He replaced his hat with quiet precision. "Good evening, Mrs. Deering. Mr. Deering." At the door he paused. "If I may offer advice, plant something honest this spring. It does wonders for the soil." Then he was gone. Later, that night, the Deerings sat in silence until the church clock struck 8. Then Clara rose and crossed to the mantelpiece. Slowly, she turned her aunt's photograph back toward the room. For the first time since the funeral, she looked directly into those severe eyes, and found them not reproachful, but faintly amused. Outside in the churchyard, the wind rustled the grass over Mrs. Copley's grave. No rose grew there now, but the ground at last seemed still. Monday morning arrived clean and unremarkable, a kind of municipal apology for the week before. The mist had lifted, the pavements shone, and Flaxborough's inhabitants, finding no new scandal to improve upon, returned to their natural state of civic innocence. At the police station, Sergeant Love was completing a report that, as usual, contained both more words and fewer facts than necessary. Inspector Pirbright sat opposite him, dictating with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had already decided which truths deserved to survive the paperwork. Subject: Copley, Mildred, deceased. Summary: investigation concluded, no criminal proceedings recommended. Findings: matter concerned private financial irregularities and posthumous misunderstandings, funds restored, public confidence unshaken, recommend no further action. He paused. "Public confidence," he said aloud, tapping his pen, "is a fragile plant, Love, needs light watering and frequent lies." Love smiled uncertainly. "So that's it, then? For us, yes. For Flaxborough, never." He signed the final page with his usual elegant scrawl, then leaned back. "Mrs. Copley may rest in peace at last, though I suspect she's enjoying the view from wherever she is." Love looked curious. "Do you think she planned it all, sir? The letters, the rose, everything?" Pirbright smiled. "I think she understood human nature, Sergeant, especially its urge to tidy up other people's mistakes." He rose, collecting his hat. "Come along, let's walk a bit. The air's remarkably unaccused today." The churchyard. They found Reverend Fallows supervising Mr. Hibble, who was filling in the last traces of disturbed soil. A modest wooden cross had replaced the headstone temporarily, while a mason prepared the inscription. The vicar looked up with weary relief. "I'm glad it's over, Inspector. I confess this business has done my sermons no favours." "On the contrary," said Pirbright, "I imagine you've more material than ever. Sin, repentance, misplaced horticulture, all the classics." Fallow gave a rueful smile. "I shall preach instead on mercy. Flaxborough seems in need of it." "Always," said Pirbright, "preferably in small, digestible doses. Mr. Hibble straightened his back and wiped his brow. Ground's settled now, sir. Be a fine spot for daffodils come spring. Pubright nodded. Daffodils. Much safer than roses. They bloom and die without metaphor. He turned to the vicar. You'll see to it that Mrs. Copley's bequest goes where she intended. Of course. The diocesan treasurer has confirmed receipt, officially anonymous. Splendid, said Pubright. Flaxborough will never forgive her for being generous, but at least they'll have new hymn books to disapprove of. The vicar chuckled, then grew thoughtful. You know, Inspector, I can't help feeling she'd be pleased with the outcome. Oh, undoubtedly, said Pubright. Few people achieve posthumous satisfaction with such economy. High Street, later. That day, the cosy nook tea rooms were once again the Parliament of Flaxborough. Inside, Mrs. Platt was recounting the entire affair to Miss Teat, who, though she had supplied half the information, listened with fascination as if hearing it for the first time. So the inspector says there was no murder at all, Mrs. Platt declared. Only a misunderstanding about money, imagine, and to think I suspected witchcraft. Miss Teat stirred her tea with moral authority. Well, witchcraft or no, it did the town no harm. Everyone's behaving much better this week. Even Councillor Harby has started paying for his own stationery. Mrs. Platt nodded approvingly. That's Inspector Pubright for you. Never arrests anyone, but everyone ends up confessing to something. Outside, unseen by either, Pubright paused by the window, listening to the comfortable hum of Flaxborough, setting its conscience to music. He smiled faintly and moved on. The station, evening. Back at his desk he poured himself the last of the lukewarm tea from the pot. The day's unofficial conclusion. He opened a fresh page in his notebook and wrote, not for record, but reflection. There are towns that forget their dead, and towns that listen for them. Flaxborough listens, Woody, mostly out of habit, partly out of guilt. The living here have a touching faith that every whisper has a moral, if only one listens long enough. He paused, then added, Mildred Copley left behind two things, a rose that wilted and a truth that didn't. The former was buried again. The latter, being inconvenient, is now local history. He closed the book, leaned back, and regarded the ceiling with mild contentment. The town clock chimed 6, slow and dutiful. Outside, dusk settled over the roofs, turning the river into a long strip of pewter. In the churchyard, the wind passed gently over the grass, and for a moment, or perhaps imagination, a single petal, dried and crimson, drifted loose from somewhere unseen and came to rest on Mrs. Copley's grave. Inspector Pubright, standing by his office window, saw it, smiled, and said softly, Even flowers know when to stop blooming. He closed the blinds. Flaxborough, satisfied, went back to sleep.